Caribou are an iconic species in Canada. Also known as reindeer, caribou are one of the species that have defined cultures on this land for generations. With a wide historical habitat, caribou have been a source of food, clothing, and tools for millennia, and hold immense value in Indigenous cultural stories. They're also an important indicator of boreal forest health and are even featured on the Canadian Quarter. But in the boreal forests of Western North America, caribou are under threat, largely because of wildfires. Caribou homes in the boreal ecozone are becoming smaller and more fragmented than ever. And in the age of climate change, hotter and more frequent wildfires are increasingly threatening caribou habitats. But hang on, if caribou evolved in an area with frequent wildfires, why are they so dangerous now? That's what we're talking about today. Specifically, how exactly are caribou affected by wildfire? And how can we use that knowledge to protect these iconic animals? So join me for today's episode of
Science with Thomas.
Part 1.
Lichens. Lichens. What are lichens?
Now, in order to understand how fires affect caribou, we first need to know about caribou diets, which are largely made up of these organisms called lichens. Lichens are these super cool organisms that thrive in extreme conditions. Here at the UBC Point Grey campus, we can see swaths of them growing around, such as these green things on this dead tree branch here, to growing out of benches, even growing right on concrete blocks. For some caribou herds, lichens make up 80% of their diet during winter. In fact, a 2011 study for a herd in Alaska found that caribou choose to live in areas with at least 1,250 kilograms of lichen per hectare, or about 20% cover. That is a huge amount of lichen, and one might say that they really lichen those habitats. Now let's go back to wildfires. How are lichen affected by fire? Perhaps unsurprisingly, lichens burn. They're often on the front lines of the fire since they grow on the outside exposed parts of trees. And they tend to grow back pretty slowly. So in the short term at least, fires limit food availability for caribou. But how slowly do they grow back? A 2019 study from the Yukon found that after fire, it takes a whopping 50 years for lichens to grow back to the caribou selection level on average. But another recent study from the boreal region of Saskatchewan found a pattern with 2 peaks in lichen abundance, at 25 years after fire and again at 100 years after fire. An explanation for this is that intermediate-aged forests are so dense that they create shadier, wetter conditions, allowing for mosses to outcompete lichens on tree surfaces. And a 2016 study from Alberta found that burn severity is the most important factor to consider. The researchers compared burn severity to lichen percent cover 4 years after a fire. And for severe fires, no lichen were found at all. For less intense fires, lichen percent cover ranged from 5% to 70%, but most areas that experienced fire were still below the caribou selection threshold. So clearly, lichen availability decreases following wildfire, but predicting exactly when they'll recover is really hard to determine. But there's still a major question to consider. How do caribou actually respond to the changing lichen availability? And can we predict how those responses change with urban development and climate change? Part 2.
Fires in a changing world. Changing world.
We might expect that caribou mortality would increase and population growth would decrease following wildfire because of smaller habitats and less lichen available. This is exactly what was hypothesized in a 2007 paper that looked at caribou populations before and after wildfire in Alberta. But to the researchers' surprise, caribou herd sizes weren't significantly affected by the presence of fire, even if up to 76% of their home ranges had burned in the 1990s. What happened instead was that the caribou home ranges were large enough that the caribou just avoided the parts that were burned in the past 50 years, and they collected lichens from the undisturbed parts. So, wildfire doesn't affect caribou population sizes? There's a few additional things to consider. First, this paper is from 2007, and talked about fires in the 90s. Our landscape has changed quite a bit since then, largely because of human activity. With more roads, settlements, campgrounds, and logging, caribou habitats are much more fragmented. With a smaller, more divided habitat, caribou cannot rely on their avoidance strategy as much, and they can't find the lichen they need to survive. Fire also promotes the growth of grasses, which can attract deer and moose, bringing more predators into caribou habitats such as wolves. This is another way that caribou are affected by fire. Second, climate change has increased the severity and frequency of wildfires. The BC Wildfire Service has reported that total burned area per year is increasing because of longer and drier drought seasons. And earlier this year, the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute reported that in the 2023 fire season alone, 13 or 14% of some boreal habitats were lost to fire. When it takes up to 100 years for lichens to recover, this is a huge loss. Thus, while fire may not have been a significant factor impacting caribou in the past, today it is exacerbating their decline. And so, what can we do about this? What role do conservationists, firefighters, and the general public have to play here? Can we protect caribou from wildfire? Part 3.
Management considerations.
There are lots of actions that need to be taken. First, long-term caribou conservation plans set targets for the amount of restored habitat in a certain amount of time. In the Bichteau Lake, Alberta sub-regional plan, they have a target of recovering 65% of caribou critical habitat in the next 100 years. Part of the plan's development has used computer models to predict how forests will change with seismic line recovery and future forest harvest to ensure attainable goals. However, wildfire effects have been left out of these models. And without considering lichen or habitat loss from fires, logging companies are given the green light to harvest more trees, keeping caribou under threat. So, we need to add wildfire effects to habitat modeling to ensure conservation efforts are successful. There's also recommendations for wildland firefighters. One tool that firefighters use to prevent large forest fires is to fight fire with fire. By starting smaller, more manageable fires at wetter times of year, fuels are cleared from the forest floor, preventing more dangerous fires in summer. In fragmented caribou habitat though, even these small prescribed fires can target the lichens and still do harm to caribou that don't have anywhere else to go. And so other fire prevention techniques, such as fire retardant or stricter campfire and smoking regulations, may help caribou more in the short term. And you can help protect boreal caribou too. If you weren't convinced already, protecting caribou habitats from wildfires is a strong reason to stop global fossil fuel emissions and slow climate change. This can be done through lobbying local and federal governments and making personal lifestyle changes to reduce fossil fuel emissions. In summary, the relationship between wildfires and boreal caribou is more complicated than one might guess at first. While fires reduce the availability of lichens, how quickly lichens recover really depends on the specifics of the fire and the site, and can range from 25 to over 100 years. And while wildfire may not have been too dangerous for caribou in the past, in today's fragmented habitats and climate change, caribou are unable to avoid burned areas. This suggests the need for action, whether in the form of better conservation habitat modeling, more careful fire management strategies, or reducing fossil fuel emissions. And ultimately, there's a role for everyone to play to protect caribou in Western North America. Thanks for watching. If you liked this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Aww.
Science with Thomas.